I just want to say I'm thankful for all of you. We prayed this morning, thankfulness for the things that God has given us. And Justin mentioned it, but I'll reiterate is that you can spend who knows how long thanking God for the things that He's given us. Whenever you stop to take stock, it's not our tendency, I know. Our tendency is usually to ask God and talk to God about the things that we're lacking. But when you stop and you take stock of what God has given you and you start saying thank you, it's almost like you can't stop. Like you say thank you for one thing and that reminds you of five other things, and you keep going. I was back there, I was praying, I was thanking God for these chairs, and I was thanking God for electricity, and I was thanking God for each of you and this time that we get to spend together today, thanking God for the beautiful weather outside. He really does give us a lot of really good gifts, and I just want to say that I'm thankful for you all. And I'm thankful for this passage that we get to look at this morning. In Matthew chapter 20, we're continuing our sermon series through the book of Matthew entitled Our King. We're going to be in Matthew chapter 20, and I want to say, just by way of a little context or recalibration, I could call it that, because we've been going through Matthew. This is our 60th sermon through the book of Matthew. We started this January of last year, and it looks like it's going to carry us through to the end of the year. So just a little recap, because what we're going to see here, this passage today, marks the end of a major narrative section of Matthew and the beginning of the last major narrative section of Matthew. So let me tell you a little bit about what I mean by that, because we remember Jesus, early on in Matthew, we saw the lineage of Jesus and how Jesus came through the line of David, which was very important. He's been referred to as the Son of David several times, and we're going to see it several more times over the next few weeks, indicating that he is not just a prophet or a miracle worker or a really good guy, that he is, in fact, the promised Messiah. So Matthew let us know that from chapter 1, he was getting us on board with the idea that this Jesus, the one that was crucified, he is the Messiah. And then we saw Jesus as he was raised and he moved around, and then as he came of age, he was baptized by John the Baptist, and then he went into the desert to be tempted by Satan. And he slammed the door in Satan's face. He said, "Get out of here, Satan." And then he came back from the wilderness, and it says in Matthew chapter 4, verse 17, from that day he began his ministry preaching, "The kingdom of God is at hand." So he moves into his ministry, and we see over the next several chapters what we refer to as Sermon on the Mount is Jesus' teaching, what I believe is a compilation of Jesus' teaching over his lifetime that Matthew put together for us. And we see the different things that he taught on, several ways that Jesus raised the bar for righteousness. So he was looking at the crowds, and over his ministry, he realized that most people consider themselves to be more righteous than they really are. But even at that low standard, you think you're more righteous than you really are. Jesus took that standard and he kicked it up a few notches to a place where it was impossible. He said adultery, you pat yourself on the back for not committing adultery, but I'm telling you that if you look at a woman or a man the wrong way while you're married, that's not your spouse, you've committed adultery. So Jesus, in the Sermon on the Mount, we see that several different ways that he raised the bar for righteousness to levels of impossibilities. Which was very intentional. And then as we came out of that, Jesus continued his ministry. We saw that he handed off his ministry to his disciples. And he said, now you go and do it. You go to different towns and you teach and you perform miracles. We saw discipleship in action, where Jesus, up to that point, it had been his ministry. And then he passed it on to his disciples. And then from there, we saw Jesus interacting with the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And they're always stepping up to him. And he always has an answer for him. And then in chapter 16, we've noted this several times over the last couple of months. In chapter 16, another shift happened because Peter declared, "We believe that you are the Messiah. You are the Christ." And Jesus said, "You're right, but don't tell anybody." He warned them, don't say anything about that. And then from that point on, it says that he began to teach them, saying that he was going to have to be killed. 3 times since chapter 16, over the last couple of months as we've been going through this series, Jesus has said, the Son of Man has to be delivered over to the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the chief priests, those guys, to be killed and to be resurrected. So he's letting them know that is what's about to happen. And during that time, we've also been talking a lot about humility. Jesus has been teaching his disciples and us over and over again what is required to enter into the kingdom of heaven. And humility has been the refrain through many of the last 3 chapters that we have looked at. And now we get to the point as we close out chapter 20. I want to let you know that when we start chapter 21, a shift has occurred. So what we're going to see, we're going to close out chapter 20 today, and then next week we're going to go into chapter 21, which is the triumphal entry, which many of you are probably familiar with, that imagery of Jesus riding into Jerusalem. And what we're going to see whenever we get to chapter 21 is that there's no more hush-hush about who Jesus is. So before, they said, "You're the Christ," and Jesus said, "Yeah, but don't tell anybody. We're going to keep that to ourselves for now." But Jesus, in chapter 21, we're going to see the shift happen where Jesus is no longer undercover Messiah. He's coming into Jerusalem with a crowd of people around him, his own entourage riding into Jerusalem during Passover time, which historians say means that the population of Jerusalem was sometimes 6 times what it normally was. So Jesus is coming into Jerusalem and people are shouting his praise, "Hosanna, Son of David." There's no secret anymore. So I'm saying that's where we're going to see that next week as Jesus comes in. But this week is going to close out a major narrative section where Jesus, up to this point, he's been working, and yeah, he's got some fame. People know who he is. People know what he does. He has a crowd of people that are following him as he makes the trip to Jerusalem. But after this week, Jesus himself is going to be drawing that attention. He's going to be the one that's making waves, that is making a name for himself in Jerusalem. We're going to see ultimately that is the catalyst for him being handed over to the chief priest to be killed. So we're going to close out chapter 20 this week. And I said the title of today's message is going to be "The King Grants Sight." So Jesus, he's traveled. He has his disciples with him. He has a crowd with him. And I entitled this message, "The King Grants Sight," because in this passage, we will see Jesus literally heal blind men. That literally happens. But what we're also going to notice is that Jesus is correcting and healing and fixing the sight, the spiritual sight of his disciples all along the way. And it reminds me of, I don't know how many of y'all know this, but I was adopted at the age of 15. And it reminds me of something that my parents used to talk about when I came in to live with their family. And they would say, like, Jordan, we basically have to retrain you, because for the first 15 years of your life, your whole life up to this point, you've only ever seen family done poorly. You've only ever seen bad examples of what it means to be a father or a husband or a brother. So my parents used to talk about, now that you're coming into a family with a godly husband, a godly wife, godly brothers, a family structure that is correct, we have to retrain your thinking about what family looks like. And I remember my parents talking about, like, you're 15, we're supposed to be teaching you how to be a man, but first we have to retrain you how to be a kid. We have to retrain you how to be part of a family so that we can raise you up to be a man. And in a lot of ways, that's what Jesus is doing for his disciples. For however many years they had been trained by the world what it meant to be great, what it meant to be powerful, what it meant to have prestige. And so Jesus has been retraining their thinking, has been fixing their sight on those things and ours for the last 2 months as we've been studying this through this series. And he continues that today. So even though we are going to see that Jesus literally heals sight, I wanted to point out that Jesus also spiritually heals our sight, retrains our ways of seeing and thinking. So the title of today's message is "The King Grants Sight." This is going to be Matthew chapter 20, verses 20 through 34. We're going to see this in 3 movements. First, we're going to see a mother's request. That's going to be in verses 20 through 23. And then second, we're going to see the greatness of servitude. The greatness of servitude. That's going to be in verses 24 through 28. And then finally, we're going to see that Jesus grants sight to the lowly. And I mean that literally and spiritually. So let's look at this. We're going to start with verses 20 through 23. It says this, Then the mother of the sons of Zebedee came to Jesus with her sons, bowing down and making a request of him. And he said to her, What do you wish? She said to him, Command that in your kingdom these two sons of mine may sit one on your right and one on your left. But Jesus answered, You do not know what you are asking. Are you able to drink the cup that I am about to drink? And they said to him, We are able. And he said to them, My cup you shall drink, but to sit on my right and on my left, that is not mine to give, but it is for those for whom it has been prepared by my Father. So starting out this passage, this last movement before we get to Jerusalem, we see a mother's request. Mother comes before Jesus and says, When you are on your throne, I want you to command that my two sons are going to be on your right and on your left. And that might seem a little bit strange whenever we read this mom of these disciples showing up. But a couple of things that I want to point out just for the sake of context so that we kind of know where she's coming from. The first thing is that I've alluded to it already, but I think whenever we read the Gospels, whenever we read, as we've been studying through the book of Matthew, we tend to think that Jesus is traveling with only his disciples. And it's easy to think that because most of, if not all of his interactions are with his disciples. He's talking to his disciples and teaching his disciples. But there are multiple times, and this is one of them, where we see that it's not just his disciples that are with him, but that he has a crowd that is traveling with him. And at least part of that crowd is the family of his disciples. Now, we saw in the Gospels that when he called James and John, that they left their father and they followed him, but apparently they didn't leave mom behind because here she is with them as they're approaching Jerusalem. Another point about that is the fact that because Passover is coming up, there are droves of people that would have been traveling that same road to Jerusalem to go in for Passover. So there you have Jesus and he has his disciples. So we think about the layers of insulation here. We have Jesus and his disciples, but also he has a crowd from Galilee that's been following him because he's a miracle worker. So these people that have been traveling with him. And then there's probably also hundreds of people on the road with them that are just happen to be going the same way because Passover is coming up. So I wanted to just expand our thinking here that it's not just Jesus and his 12 guys going down the road, that there are people, an abundance of people around as they're traveling. So it's not weird that, I say all that to say, it's not weird that James and John's mom would pop up here to make this question. It wasn't like she was waiting for him on the road, tapping her toe, like, I'm going to talk to this Jesus. No, she most likely, she was traveling with them. The other thing that I think might sound odd, but once we get a little bit of context, it's not too odd, is her request. So mom pops up and she says, I want you to command that my boys will be on your right and on your left when you're sitting on your throne. And that might sound odd, like you're reaching pretty high there, Mom. That's a bold request. But if you remember back in Matthew chapter 19, verse 28, Jesus has already said that whenever the Son of Man sits on his throne, that there will be 12 other thrones for his followers, and they're going to be sitting on them. Y'all remember that? Jesus said that? And I'm sure, she's part of the group. She's been traveling with them, so she's probably picking up on that idea. So she's envisioning Jesus on his throne, 12 thrones, and she wants her boys to be in a position of importance, of prominence. She wants them at the right and on the left. So she makes that request of Jesus. And Jesus' response here, I think, opens our eyes to two things that we'll see. First thing he says here in verse 22, says that he answered him, he said, you do not know what you are asking. Are you able to drink the cup that I am about to drink? And it says, they said to him, so this is the boys now, this is the brothers, they say, yes, we're able. Now, if you've been reading the Bible like I have, I feel like I'm almost geared for Jesus to say, no, you're not. They're like, yeah, we're able to drink that cup, and I'm ready for Jesus to shoot him down. But Jesus says, yeah, you will drink my cup. And I think the cup that he's talking about, obviously, is the suffering and giving your life for the kingdom. This is something that that we know that Jesus is going to do, and historians have pointed out several times. This isn't going to be new coming from me, but that the disciples followed him in that as well, that suffering and dying for the kingdom. So Jesus says, yeah, you will drink my cup. But the first thing I want to point out here is that this position of prominence, the sitting on the thrones, even Jesus' position on the throne, that it is connected to his suffering and dying for the sake of the kingdom. Because you notice the mom didn't say anything about what they had to do to get on that throne. She just wants them to sit on the throne. And then Jesus says, you don't know what you're asking. Can they drink the cup that I'm going to drink? So to me, that sounds like Jesus is saying is the only way to get on that throne is to drink the cup that I'm about to drink, is to give your life for the sake of the kingdom. So he says, are you able to do that? He's been talking about, as they've been traveling, he's told them several times that he is going to be handed over and killed. So Jesus looks at James and John and he says, you boys ready for that? And they say, we are. We're able. And Jesus affirms that. You see in verse 23, he says, my cup you shall drink. And then he goes on to say, but to sit on my right and on my left, this is not mine to give, but it is for those for whom it has been prepared by my Father. So the second thing that Jesus revealed, the first thing was that the suffering for the kingdom was directly connected to that position of prominence of sitting on the throne in the kingdom. The second thing that Jesus reveals here is that that's not for him to decide. And this is our first hint here at what Jesus is about to say in a few verses, and that is that he has lowered himself, he has humbled himself to the position of a servant to his Father God. He is a son, he is very much God, he is equal with God because he is God. But here is another hint that we get that Jesus has humbled himself. That he says that the position of where people are sitting, that's not mine to give. That's for the Father to determine. We remember in Philippians chapter 2 that Paul makes that mention that Jesus, even though he was God, did not consider equality with God something to be grasped, but humbled himself to the point of a servant. And we see that shades of that in what Jesus just said. Jesus has humbled himself to the point of it's not even his role to determine who sits where in the kingdom. That's for the Father to determine. So at least a shade of Jesus' humility is revealed there in that he has subjected himself to the will of the Father. And in fact, both of these points that we have looked at reveal the humility of Jesus. So not only did he subject himself to the will of the Father, humble himself to come down and to be a human, but he's subjected himself to the level of he is going to suffer and die in the form of a human. Those two shades of Jesus' humility. So what we see here is what started out as a mother's request. You know, moms always looking out for their boys. I understand that. What started out as a mother's request, Jesus is going to take now and use it as another opportunity to teach about what it means to be great in the kingdom of heaven. We see that in verses 24 through 28. The greatness of servitude. So picking up there, it says, and hearing this, the 10 became indignant with the two brothers. So the other 10 disciples became indignant with the two brothers. But Jesus called them to himself and said, you know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great men exercise authority over them. It is not this way among you. But whoever wishes to become great among you shall be your servant. Whoever wishes to be first among you shall be your slave. Just as the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life a ransom for many. So I thought it was interesting. I was studying through this passage this week with a couple of y'all, and talked about the fact that over the last 2 months, leading up to Easter and since Easter, we've been talking a lot about humility, what it means to be humble, why it's important to be humble. And I thought it was interesting. I was like, man, I feel like we just keep going back to this. Jesus keeps talking about this. And we see here in verse 24 why Jesus keeps talking about it. because the other 10, they hear what's going on between James and John and their mom in this conversation with Jesus, and they become indignant, which is just it's another way to say that they're a little mad, they're a little upset, a little grumpy with the other two disciples for trying to get this one up on them. And I realize in verse 24 is like, this is why Jesus keeps talking about humility. It's because they still don't get it. And I wonder, we're hard on the disciples. They still don't get it. But I wonder if we get it, do we still not get it? We've been looking at it for 2 months now. We've been talking about humility. I feel like every other week we're bringing up humility. I wonder if we get it. I jotted down a couple of passages here that we've looked at over the last couple of months, just to remind you about how important humility is. This will be a recap for some of you. Some of y'all, this might be new, but that's okay. Matthew 17:27, y'all remember Jesus paid the temple tax. And before he paid the temple tax, he made the point clear that if anybody had any right to avoid paying the temple tax, it was him. He made that very clear. But he said, and it says it in the text, Matthew 17:27, he says, I'm going to pay the tax so as not to cause offense to them. So Jesus denying himself, and so not to cause offense to somebody else, he paid the tax. That's humility. Matthew 18:3, he says, unless you become like children, you will not enter heaven. We talked about the fact that is a salvation statement there. If you want to go to heaven, pay attention to Matthew 18:3. If you do not become like children, you will not enter heaven. And then he reiterates it in 18:4, whoever humbles himself like this child will be the greatest in the kingdom. And then in 18:22, he's talking about forgiving others. He says, you don't forgive 7 times, but 70 times 7 times. The point there being that we keep forgiving. Your pride won't let you do that. You have to be humble. He says in 19:14, let the children come to me, for to such belong the kingdom of heaven. You see how important that humility is? And then in 19:26, he's talking about entering heaven. He says, with man it is impossible, but with God all things are possible. That's a blow to your pride right there. If it's up to you, if it's up to your work, if it's up to how good you can be, it's impossible. But with God, all things are possible. And then he said in 1930, and he reiterated in 2016, we saw this last week, that the first shall be last, and the last first. Humility is of utmost importance. He reiterates it again here in verses 25 and 26. Look what he says. Jesus called them to himself and said, you know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great men exercise authority over them. But it is not this way among you. But whoever wishes to become great among you shall be your servant, and whoever wishes to be first among you shall be your slave. We'll pause right there. So we've been talking a lot about humility. And I read verse 24 and I thought, the disciples, they're still not getting it. They're indignant. Their feelings are hurt that these guys might have a greater position in heaven than they are. But I wonder, as we were reading back through those, as we were looking back at the things that we have been seeing Jesus talk about for the last 2 months specifically, I wonder how many of us have thought more intentionally about our own humility. I wonder how many of us have thought more intentionally, and by intentionally, I don't mean like this is an osmosis, like the more we hear it preached, the more we're going to be humble. I mean intentionally thinking about the way that you relate to your spouse, or the way that you relate to your children, or the way that you relate to your neighbors. Or I wonder how many of us have thought more intentionally, like spent time, brainwaves, thinking about how we relate to God, as he is our Lord and us as his servants. I wonder how many of us have gotten to that point of considering what really is important. Not what the world thinks is important, but what really is important. Because the reality is that we cannot, not that we shouldn't, but we can't go on thinking the same way that we did before we were saved after we were saved. It's not possible. We can't go on thinking the same way the world does after we have given our lives to Christ. Stop it. We have to think in a different way. So when we hear Jesus say things like, unless you humble yourself like a child, you're not going to heaven, we have to take those things seriously. He says it over and over again because this is something that is missing from each of our lives. We are trained by the world to think of self first. And it's missing from each of our lives. It was missing from the disciples. And that's why he tells them, if you want to be great, you have to become a servant. If you want to be first in the kingdom, you have to be a slave. And then in verse 28, he tells us why that's the case. And I get that from those first two little words in verse 28. It says, just as. What those words reveal is that the basis for our humility is the example of humility that Jesus gives us. So he says, you have to become a servant, you have to become a slave, just as the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life a ransom for many. So we live humbly just as Jesus lived humbly. This is of the utmost importance. I do want to point out here that Jesus' humility, Jesus' humiliation, if I can use that word, his becoming humble, his stepping down from God into the form of man, that is humiliation to a degree that we can't comprehend. That is the idea that he stepped down from God to become man is unfathomable. We think about how hard it is for us to lower ourselves, for us to be humble with our spouse or our friends or other people in the church, for us to be humble. The difference in degree of that humiliation, it's like the difference in the space between the Sangre de Cristos and Sycamore Pine, or the Jemez Mountains over here, and the space between us in this room. The difference in that space, it's incalculable. Jesus talks about being humble. He's done it to a degree that we can hardly fathom and could never accomplish. And he's calling us to step off of our little false pedestals of pride and to be servants to one another. We can do that. So we become humble. When I say we become humble just as Jesus became humble, I don't want you to think that we're going to accomplish the same things that Jesus accomplished. That's not going to happen. But we can do it just like he did. He became humble. We become humble. I want to point out that degree of humiliation that we can't calculate. We can calculate how far the sun is from earth, but we can't calculate how far being a man is from being God. That degree of humiliation that Jesus did, he did it for you. For you. I'm not pointing at anybody, one person. He did it for us. That's what he means here in verse 28. He came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life a ransom for many. Now, this is another time, if you're counting, this is the fourth time that Jesus has foretold his death. But this is the only time that he has explicitly stated the purpose for his death. And that purpose is a ransom for us. So we see that the humiliation of Jesus, that it was one, to save your life from sin and hell, but it was two, as an example for us who are to follow him. That's the greatness of servitude. So we shouldn't take that matter lightly. We read passages like this of like, yeah, that's how the Gentiles act. It's not going to be that way with you. If you want to be first, you have to be last. If you want to be great, you have to become a servant. That's how the economy of heaven works, because that's what Jesus established. by humbling himself to the point of a servant, even to the point of death on a cross. So we follow him in that. Now, what we're going to see in these last few verses, verses 29 through 34, as we close out the chapter, is we're going to see that servitude of Jesus, that servanthood of Jesus, play out practically in the miracle that he's going to perform for these guys. So what we're going to see finally is that Jesus grants sight to the lowly. It says this in verse 29, as they were leaving Jericho, a large crowd followed him. And two blind men sitting by the road, hearing that Jesus was passing by, they cried out, Lord, have mercy on us, Son of David. The crowd sternly told them to be quiet, but they cried out all the more, Lord, Son of David, have mercy on us. And Jesus stopped and called them and said, what do you want me to do for you? And they said to him, Lord, we want our eyes to be opened. Moved with compassion, Jesus touched their eyes, and immediately they regained their sight and followed him. So we see as Jesus is moving through, he's on his final approach into Jerusalem. As he's moving through, the crowd is with him, and two blind guys are over on the side of the road, and they hear who's moving by. They hear about Jesus, and they start crying out, Lord, have mercy on us. And it says that the crowd sternly told them to be quiet. And I think that that's so interesting. It was my clue when I was studying this. It was my clue that these guys are a nuisance to the crowd. That they're on the side of the road, they're crying out, and everybody's like, "Hey, shush! Don't bother Jesus. You know, we're rolling here with Jesus. Y'all be quiet." And that kind of opened my eyes to the fact that these guys are they're a nuisance. You know, they're an irritation. They're an annoyance, and everybody would rather they just be quiet instead of bothering them and Jesus and the thing that they have going on down the road. And I think that's important. It's important to notice that these guys are a nuisance, an irritant, because if we don't understand that, then what Jesus does in verse 32, we'll miss a little bit. Because Jesus stops, and he calls to them and says, what do you want me to do for you? So these guys, everybody else is like, hey, y'all be quiet. We got our own thing going on here. We don't need you messing it up. Jesus stops, and he goes and he asks, what do you want me to do for you? This is a phrase of supplication, isn't it? That Jesus is putting himself at their mercy, at their will. Like a waiter, what can I get for you? He stops and he calls. Everybody else wants them to just be quiet. Jesus stops and he asks them, what can I do for you? What do you want me to do? So Jesus becoming a servant even to the lowliest, most irritable people of society. Jesus is saying, what would you have me do for you? And they say, we want our eyes to be opened. Moved with compassion, Jesus touched their eyes, and immediately they regained their sight and followed him. This movement here, that final movement in verse 34, this is what Jesus wants for all of us. That he shows up, he opens our eyes, and then we follow him. That's the movement that happens for everybody that calls themselves a Christian. Even if you weren't physically blind, Jesus shows up, he opens your eyes, and then we follow him. So we see that he literally heals the sight of these guys, but that he has spiritually and emotionally healed our own vision, correcting our sight, so that we can follow him. And I just want to say that to follow Jesus is not to like Jesus or appreciate Jesus or to think that some of the things that Jesus teaches is really good. I remember having a conversation with a Buddhist lady in her home. She had pictures all over her wall of great teachers and her spiritual guide, and there was a little depiction, a little image of Jesus, and I was like, oh, Jesus, you know Jesus. And she was like, yeah, he was a great teacher. That's not following Jesus. Not putting Jesus as one of the many pictures on the wall of your life that you care about. That's not what it means to follow Jesus. Following Jesus, at least in a way that leads to eternal life in heaven, means loving him and being like him. That's what it means to follow Jesus. How could we possibly say and mean, I have given my life to Jesus, if our lives don't look like Jesus? So as we move into a time of reflection and final singing, Stan's going to come up here. He's going to lead us in another song. I encourage you to take this time to reflect on not just today's sermon, but on all of the stuff that we've been talking about for the last couple of months. This kind of feels like a period, and we're about to start a new sentence next week. So I encourage you to take some time to think about your own humility, your own view of yourself and your role and your walk with Jesus. Because a lot of people, I don't want to project on anybody. A lot of people tend to bring Jesus along as an accessory to the lives that they themselves want to live, and that is not what following Jesus means. Following Jesus means that when he says something, we do it. Whenever he teaches something, that this is how you think, this is how you act, this is how you communicate with people, this is how you feel about people, these are the things that you do, that we do it. That's what it means to follow Jesus.